First of all, good evening and welcome everyone. I'm Kip Weedle, Associate Professor of History here at Bethel College and Chair of the Menno Simons Lecture Series Committee. This is our 72nd lecture series, and in a moment I'm going to introduce our speaker, but first I want to say a few words about the series itself. The Menno Simons Lectureship Endowment, which makes the series possible, was established in 1950 by the John P. and Carolina Schrog Kaufman family to promote the study of Anabaptist and Mennonite history, thought, life, and culture. Every year since 1953, it has brought recognized scholars and artists to the Bethel College campus to share their research or public lectures. In 1997, the fund was substantially enriched by a contribution from the William E. and Meta Gehring Yonke family. Tonight we welcome Dr. Eric Schmaltz, Professor of History and Global Studies at Northwestern Oklahoma State University in Alva. Several years ago, when members of the Menno Simons Lecture Series Committee, which invites the speakers, was thinking about 2024, it became obvious that inviting an authority on German-Russian migration would be appropriate. As many of you know, this year marks the 150th anniversary of the migration of Germans from Russia to central Kansas. And some of the families who migrated later played roles in the founding of Bethel College. Once we had our topic, we had to decide on a speaker, and that did not take long. From his impressive and voluminous work, we knew Dr. Schmaltz to be a leading authority on Germans in Russia and the former Soviet Union. In addition to his many journal articles, Dr. Schmaltz published a monograph titled An Expanded Bibliography and Reference Guide for the Former Soviet Union's Germans in 2003, and he contributed an article to the 2005 book German Scholars and Ethnic Cleansing, 1919 to 1945, which received the Choice Academic Book of the Year award by the American Library Association. In addition, he is both co-founder and co-director of NWOSU's Institute for Citizenship Studies. Throughout his career, Dr. Schmaltz has spoken at more than 100 conferences and public events, and we are flattered and honored to have him add the Menno Simons Lecture Series to that list. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Schmaltz to Bethel College.
Thank you so much for inviting me here for these next 2 days, intensive days on Germans from Russia, above all the Mennonites. And just a few opening remarks here as we get started. I wanted to mention just a few items, thank yous, and then some just intro remarks. This is my first time to the campus here. I've been to Heston, Kansas, Heston College some years ago. My sister-in-law, though, grew up in the Newton area. She was a Baptist. Her family's background is Baptist. And I was talking with my brother's father-in-law, and he remembers some of the Mennonite communities up here in North Newton and in the Newton area. I must admit, with my work in Germans from Russia over many years, I've gotten to know many Mennonites as colleagues and acquaintances. They're everywhere. And they're probably one of the best networked, one of the best motivated and best organized groups as a subgroup within the Germans from Russia community. And I've been very indebted to run into some of these folks over the years through conferences and so forth. By the way, I just want to mention very briefly before we get started, I had a chance to meet with Dr. Eileen Friesen, who was last year's speaker. Last month we were at the University of Wisconsin talking about Germans from Russia. So I got to see your last year's speaker. She did a wonderful job up there in Madison back in September. At any rate, a few opening remarks as we get started here. The topic is a big one, where to begin. In a way, I'm going to be dealing with a few hundred years of history across 4 continents in the next 2 days. And this is just the tip of the iceberg. I'm not Mennonite. I'm not a Mennonite expert, but I've learned a lot about the Mennonites. And this is a way of just kind of providing an overview of a really dynamic history over the last about 250 years. And we're going to use Russia as kind of the crux of the matter. We're not dealing with the Pennsylvania Dutch who went to Pennsylvania from northwestern Europe. We're dealing with those Mennonites who went east, perhaps first to Poland, maybe Prussia, West Prussia, and then, of course, the Russian Empire, and then from Russia to North and South America. Now, tonight we're going to be dealing with the Russian part of the story as the foundation. Tomorrow we'll deal with North America and South America, respectively. There will be some overlap here in some of the topics, so this will kind of whet your appetite for tomorrow's talks. But this is the main title for the three talks. The Russian Mennonite diasporas, plural, multiple diasporas we're talking about, on 4 continents, in the age of empires, the age of revolutions, and of course the age of extremes since the late 18th century. By the way, this term, or these terms, age of empires, age of revolutions, the age of extremes, is actually, these are terminologies that were used by a very noted historian from Great Britain in the last half of the 20th century, wrote a number of monographs dealing with this period. That's Eric Hobsbawm, who was a British historian, European historian. So we're indebted to him really for that terminology. But it fits appropriately with the Mennonite experience, as we're going to find out here tonight. Okay. Tonight's lecture is a little bit more specific. The first of the 3, pioneers in the East, Mennonite migrations and settlements in the former Russian Empire, the former Soviet Union. It's pretty ambitious. 1786 to the present. So we actually even get to the 21st century here as well. Kind of interesting, right? We're going to do it all. Now, this is a lot of text, but this is also for folks who maybe are hard of hearing or just as kind of a reference point. I like to bounce off of my text also. I kind of improvise a little bit as we go through the talk. But these are some key themes to consider, not only for tonight, but for the next 2 lectures. Kind of grounds us into kind of connecting a lot of different points of history, different geographies, different experiences. You notice the first key theme, and some of this may be familiar to some of you of this background. Mennonites are often pursuing economic and various other opportunities, religious freedom, amid ever-changing circumstances, sometimes in times of troubles. They're always on the run, on the go, to seek opportunities worldwide. And they're often really modifying, changing the landscapes that they settle in during these different diasporas, these different population movements. But they're always looking for opportunities. Oftentimes, especially in the early days, in the wars of religion, the early days of persecution, they were the outsiders among the Protestant groups in particular, not just the Catholics. And so already in the 16th century, they're looking for alternatives. They survived the wars of religion, right? The age of persecutions. They also had to deal with various conflicts, right? The 7 Years' War, Napoleonic Wars. We're going to talk about the 2 World Wars. Even the age of globalization today, we'll be talking more about that tomorrow, North and South America. That's been part of their backdrop too, historically. And the other thing I want to mention too is they also encounter sometimes relatively enlightened rulers and governments that may welcome them for a time before they have to move on again. Russia is going to be one of those parties interested in having the Mennonites settle the realm. And of course, over time, sometimes these enlightened monarchs, once they die, their successors are not so enlightened, then they have to move on. The other theme, and this is so true for many groups, but the Mennonites really are a great example of being a diaspora people, multiple diasporas. Hybrid identities. You absorb a little bit of the local culture as you move on to the next location. Of course, they retain part of their identity, whether it's the Low German, the Plattdeutsch, that came out of northwestern Europe, Holland. Of course, they learned the High German in Prussia on their way east for the liturgy, for their church services, but that's something they retain, but at the same time, they're also changing as they move into different host countries. And they'll later help shape those host countries. So they're a very diverse group, as I've encountered over the years. Some are more traditional, more old school. Some are kind of in between, more maybe conservative, but a little bit more adaptive to the outside world. And then you get those who are mainline, who you wouldn't even know that they were Mennonite until you talked with them, whether it's the style of dress or different professions they enter into. A very diverse group, but they also share a lot in common over the many centuries. But again, they're shaped by geography, climate, politics, economics. There's still something that they retain over the years. That kind of ties in with this issue of religious expression. We're going to see this coming up in some of my examples here. Over time in both Eurasia, in Europe and parts of Asia, that's part of Russia, and even the Western Hemisphere, we have this trend of more conservative Mennonite groups breaking away from more progressive ones. It's an ongoing process. It could be over issues of education, it could be over issues even of theology, roles of women, how engaged should you be with the outside world. Again, there are different interpretations, and so sometimes these communities will move on. The more conservative elements will move on to another location, and the others who stay behind are of a slightly different stripe. And again, we have the old order conservative mainline groups, everything in between. I call this the Dutch legacy. I don't know if that's a term I came up with or somebody else was actually applying it. We were talking about this at the Madison conference last month. But remember this group of Mennonites that will move east to Russia and then beyond, right? They're from Holland, and there were Anabaptists there, along with the Reformed Church, Calvinists. But there's something that they brought with them over the centuries. And again, if you think of Holland, the Netherlands, the lowlands, right, reclaiming the land from the sea, draining the swamps, building dikes, dams, canals. Those were skills that became very handy for them in some of the environments that they moved to. And later, when you go to parts of Poland or West Prussia, where you have a lot of swampy lowland areas, even these regimes that might be Catholic, like in the case of the Poles, or Lutheran or Protestant in the case of the Prussians, they say, hey, these folks might be a little bit different, they're pacifists. We can offer some incentives to them and utilize them to work and develop our economies. And so these are prime locations for them to do their work. You know, windmills, roads, canals, bridges, infrastructure. And we're going to see this theme play itself out, not just in Eastern Europe and Russia, but later North and South America, globally. So they have this capacity to transform both their local environment, culturally, economically, even religiously, but they also can transform the physical landscapes, the local environment. It's like terraforming, right? You end up transforming the countryside. And we're going to especially see that in parts of Ukraine, but also we're going to see it in North America, red winter wheat. Same thing in South America. This is a very different place now, 200 years later after their arrival, in some cases. So these are themes to think about for the rest of our workshop here, series. Now, very quickly, I teach a Renaissance Reformation class. I give a very condensed version of this. This is about 250 year, 300 year history in a way, but of course the Anabaptists are one of the four major Protestant movements to come out of the Reformation of the 16th century. We have the Lutherans, we have the Anglicans, right, the Church of England, we've got the Reformed, sometimes better known as the Calvinists, with the Reformed tradition, and we have the Anabaptists, right, the adult Baptists. Four major groups. And as I tell my students, they had a very troubling beginning in some cases. They were kind of the radicals of their day in the 1520s, the Peasants' Revolt in Germany, some apocalyptic stuff going on, and nearly got extinguished by both Catholics and fellow Protestants by the mid-1530s. But there were very few thoughtful ones within that community, Anabaptists, who saved that movement, transformed it from a more revolutionary one in terms of politics and even violence to one of pacifism, right? And taking a more moderate approach to things. Of course, we think of Menno, the former Catholic priest from Holland. He's one of those figures that basically transformed the movement after 1536. And of course, the Mennonites are named after him today. We even have a town in Oklahoma called Menno, not Menno, but Menno in northwest Oklahoma, named after him. But after the 1530s, this is the one Protestant group, and I tell my students this all the time, this was the one movement that never had its own state church. It never had backing from the government, at least not in a political sense, like the Lutherans, or the Reformed, like the Dutch Reformed, or the Swiss Reformed, or the Presbyterian Church in Scotland. They weren't the Church of England, right? Starting with Henry VIII. They're kind of on their own. They're often on the run. Not just from Catholics, but from fellow Protestants. So already by the 1530s and 40s, they're facing persecution, just on the eve of the wars of religion. And so they're looking for alternatives. Many of these folks were working class folks, increasingly rural. These were some of the outsiders of society. There were exceptions to that. But they end up moving to all parts of Europe. But this is a very distinctive group compared to the other Protestant groups. And in the late 16th century, they end up in the Kingdom of Poland, which was Catholic, but their more enlightened monarch at the time sees some potential in using this group for economic development, despite them being somewhat different. Later, Protestant Prussia invites them into what became known as West Prussia. That's parts of modern Poland today, near Danzig and some of those places. I'll talk very quickly about that later. These folks are brought in to promote agriculture, industry. Again, parts of Prussia, that includes Berlin. That's a very swampy, sandy soil. These are folks that can transform the countryside. And so, yeah, these regimes are willing to give these folks concessions for religious expression. They're able to practice their religion freely. They might get some economic incentives, certain privileges within states that have a different official religion. Now later, at times, these regimes will change their minds, especially when it comes to conscription. These folks are pacifists. They have to move on. But they end up moving east in particular. Now, of course, the Pennsylvania Dutch, they go directly to North America, right? Late 17th, early 18th centuries. Those are the Pennsylvania Dutch. That's a very different group. These are the groups that move east. They'll go to Russia. And then later, some of them will end up in North America. So we have them moving and ever moving on and on. They're on the run. Very quickly, the Mennonite migrations into the Russian Empire. Some of the earliest migrations, again, we're very much summarizing here, is recorded in 1772. There will be some Mennonites who end up in the Volga region in the late 18th century. Germans who were invited to Russia. The first group was from Hesse, parts of west central Germany. That's where Catherine the Great came from originally, before she married into the Romanov family. What's interesting about this migration of Volga Germans, that's in the latter part of the 1760s. A little bit later, you will have some Mennonites also in the Volga. But the group we're going to focus on really comes in full force after about 1786 to about 1789, up until about the 1850s. And those are the Mennonites who are in Prussian Poland, in Danzig, modern-day Gdansk, Poland. They are the ones that end up in what became known as the Ukraine today. By the way, the word Ukraine means borderland. The borderland, it's actually the name of Ukraine. It was known as Newer South Russia in the late 18th century. These were lands recently conquered from the Turkish or the Ottoman Empire. And although there were populations already living there, these are open expanses. And much like the Volga region on the edge of Central Asia, the Russian government wanted to develop these lands economically, bring in potential labor force. These immigrant colonists, as they were called, are also meant as a buffer between them and other peoples on the realm's borders. So after 1786 through the 1850s, we're looking at focusing more on the Mennonites in Ukraine, what was known as South Russia at the time. So at any rate, that kind of gives you the idea. There were a number of, as I said, Catherine the Great, a number of rulers, Paul I, the emperor, and then Catherine's grandson, Alexander I, issued a number of decrees inviting these folks to immigrate, and others from all parts of Europe to settle in parts of the periphery of the empire. And some of the Mennonites were their home. What's interesting about some of this, again, the Mennonites end up in places like Crimea, places near Kortitsa, just north of there, and the Malachna settlement. So Kortitsa was the first one in 1789, and then after 1803, 1804, under Alexander I, in Malachna. These became kind of the bastions of the Mennonites. By the way, there will be Mennonites later, especially in view of land hunger after the 1890s, along with others who will go to the frontier of Siberia, Russian Empire. But we're going to be focusing on these groups here in Ukraine. These are the pictures of the two key rulers. I left Paul out. That was Catherine's son. Some speculation may have been about her husband was assassinated. Catherine's was. Paul's death is kind of mysterious circumstances. But these two folks would fall under the rubric of enlightened despots. These are absolute rulers who are also, in one sense, kind of progressive. They're products of the Enlightenment, at least early in their careers. So promoting the economy, promoting science, economic development. Catherine herself, of German background, she issues a manifesto in 1762, sends out agents across Europe, not so successful. But after 1763, following the 7 Years' War's devastations, there are people now hearing the call. And again, she's offering a number of incentives for people to settle in her empire. Paul will do the same thing with his manifesto of 1804. And actually, that's the one that some of my families who were Catholic and Lutheran heeded in the years following that. They ended up in Western Ukraine. So they came under Alexander I, but he's kind of following the example of his grandmother, Catherine the Great. And by the way, they're recruiting people everywhere from Scotland to Sweden to Italy, France. It wasn't just the Germans. There are all sorts of different folks who were heeding the call. This is very quickly the major migrations of Germans from Russia, or Germans to Russia, right? They became Germans from Russia later. From especially parts of Germany we're kind of focusing on here. There are all sorts of routes. But again, the Volga Germans are the first in the late 1760s. After the 1780s, up to the 1850s, especially Ukraine. And of course, you kind of see here Crimea. Just north of there is Kortitsa, Malachna, these settlements here by the Black Sea. So much more we can talk about. These are kind of concentrated German communities in Eastern Europe in the yellow. This is a very common map that's available online. I like to use that, kind of highlights the different enclaves. Go back here. Get that way. Of course, we had a number of German groups, even going back to the Middle Ages in parts of southeastern Europe and the Austro-Hungarian Empire, in parts of Romania, of course, Poland, even in the Baltic states. We have the Baltic Germans, a different group. But what's interesting, these groups here, these became known as the Black Sea Germans. That includes the Mennonites as well. You got Lutherans, Catholics, Mennonites. Here are the Volga Germans. Some Mennonites, lots of Lutherans, Catholics. Later, you have daughter colonies, the Caucasus region, as we move to the mid-19th century. And later, you will have some movement in the 1890s into Siberia by some of these groups as well. But these are kind of the main areas, the Black Sea Germans, the Volga, among two major subgroups that we're going to be talking about. And again, the Mennonites are part of that. Again, more to talk about. We've been talking about one of the themes of the course or the lecture series here, this idea of transforming the physical environment, not just the social environment. And just to highlight a really great example of this, and we'll see maybe examples of this in North and South America's cases, Johann Cornys, 1789 to 1848. I like his birth and death dates. He's born at the beginning of the French Revolution. He died in 1848. That's the year of the 1848 revolutions. So he's living during a very revolutionary time, right? The age of revolutions here, among many other things. And this idea of the Mennonite Commonwealth. Has anybody ever heard of the Mennonite Commonwealth? Got a couple folks here. A+, all right. Okay, this was new to me some years ago as I started doing more reading. Absolutely fascinating. He's a Mennonite who made it big, became very successful as a farmer, as an entrepreneur, came from pretty humble circumstances. He was from West Prussia, ended up in the Malachna region, just north of Crimea, in the early 19th century. He made a fortune. He proved to be a kind of a community leader, very innovative, very progressive for his day. He promoted quite extensive agricultural and educational reforms in some of the communities there in the Malachna settlements. even received some encouragement from the more enlightened Russian authorities as well. Again, this is why they brought these immigrant colonists in the first place, right, to develop the economy. And he even became a model, or at least his reforms became a model for Russians and other minorities in the area to follow, to emulate. So this had to reach even beyond the Mennonite community. So here we have this Mennonite kind of endeavor to kind of reach out to a wider community. He contributed to what became known as the Mennonite Commonwealth. This is probably the next best thing to having your own state. It was virtually a state within the Russian realm. Again, the Russian imperial authorities can delegate certain authority at the local level. But remember, the Mennonites never had their own state government. They never had their own national state. But this is about the next best thing you can get to. And so the Mennonite Commonwealth was, almost like a country within a country, a state within a state. A very exceptional case in its far-flung long history. He played a key role, as I said, in transforming the Russian countryside, literally physically. Talk about that Dutch aspect here. This included the planting of more than 5 million, especially fruit trees, in nearly 4 dozen Mennonite villages in the Malachna enclave. You remember, these are the wide open steppes of Ukraine. It looks like Kansas or North Dakota or parts of Oklahoma. There are not a lot of trees out there originally. And so this is transforming the countryside. He's actually, laying the groundwork for forests on the open steppes. But this is interesting. The other thing we talk about is that you'll have some variety within the Mennonite communities. Right? The more conservative, the more traditional maybe versus the more mainline or even progressive. And so he was more engaged with more secular trends of the day, including some of the European university systems. He's encouraging folks to go to university as well, outside of their local communities. He wasn't always well liked. He was kind of a enlightened, I want to say enlightened despot, enlightened dictator, if you will. He did have his critics as well as supporters, but especially among the Mennonite Old Guard, who were a little bit more concerned with the direction he was taking. But he's a great example of this transformation of literally the physical countryside. I mentioned a number of other different religious denominations. By 1897, let me just mention one other thing here. The Mennonite population continues to grow in the course of the 19th century. Between 1880 and 1914, so in those 2 generations before World War I, the Mennonite population of Russia increased more than almost 2.5 times, from around 40,000 to over 100,000 people. So we have massive population growth. And this is true among some of the other German subgroups in Russia as well. And this will later lead, of course, to land hunger and some other pressures. But this shows you the breakdown. The Mennonites are a very small group. This is 1897. So this is about halfway in between that rapid population growth. But you'll notice the largest group among Germans from Russia, or Germans in Russia, are the evangelical Lutherans. They're almost, over three quarters of the 1.9 million, or nearly 1.8 million, who were registered in the 1897 imperial census of Russia. So they're the core. They're the largest group. And later, we look at trends of immigration tomorrow. In North America, a large number of Lutherans and other Protestants will move to the United States, along with some Catholics, of course, and a few others. In South America, we see a much larger Catholic migration with a few Protestants and Mennonites as well. But they're the 3rd largest group. The Catholics are number 2 at only 13.5% of that 1.8 million. Mennonites are less than 4%. The Reformed Church, who are often sometimes in the Lutheran villages, most villages were segregated by denomination. You've got 3.6%. You're just behind the Mennonites. There were some Baptists. The Baptists start creeping in this picture in the course of the last half of the 19th and early 20th centuries, especially through missionary work from Great Britain and Germany, Baptist and missionary societies, which drove the Russian authorities crazy. And by the way, the Baptists will be one of the fastest growing groups during the Soviet period in the 1950s up through the 1980s. But that's a different group altogether. But they're very small at this point. The Greek Orthodox are few in the Greek Orthodox. There's a few other Christian denominations. There were some Jews and non-Christians among this category. very small percentage. But they're the third largest group. But they're way behind the Lutherans and Catholics. Now things start changing. We talk about age of empires. We talk about ages of revolution and extremes, especially in the 20th century. We're in the last days of the great empires, the late 19th, early 20th century. And here the Russian Empire is trying to reform itself. These are two very important political figures in the wake of Catherine and Alexander the First. We have Alexander the Second. He's a reformer. Russia has a tendency to have reform-minded czars, followed by a reactionary, followed by a reform-minded czar, followed by a reactionary. We see the same thing with the Soviet leadership. You get a reformer like Khrushchev, hardliner like Brezhnev, then you end up with Gorbachev, and then we're done with the Soviet Union. But he's a reformer, Alexander II. He's known as the Tsar Liberator. He emancipated the serfs in 1861. He initiated some legal reforms at the local level. But in the process, he's also going to begin to promote equality among his subjects as he tries to unify and modernize the empire. And that will revoke the privileges that were granted under Catherine and Alexander, just several decades earlier. And again, this is the problem with absolute monarchs, even enlightened ones. As one of my professors used to say, you can guarantee certain privileges for all eternity, for all time, but as soon as you die, the next absolute ruler can revoke them for all time. So that's the trade-off. In any case, we'll mention a little bit more about Alexander's reforms in just a moment here. Alexander III, his successor, by the way, Alexander II was assassinated by a revolutionary. His son, Alexander III, he's known as the peacemaker. He avoids war in Europe, but he is pushing for Russification of the empire. After the 1880s, there's a real push to Russify, and that will have a big impact on Mennonites and others who are national minorities within this multinational state. So at any rate, things are changing after the 1860s. Now there's a lot of text here. We have something called push-pull factors. What pushes people to emigrate or migrate? And what pulls them to certain locations? Are there opportunities, incentives to do that? So push-pull, that's a very common sociological concept. But there are multiple overlapping reasons for the Mennonite migrations now to North and South America out of Russia, starting in the early 1870s. And like we said, we're on the 150th anniversary right now of the first settlements here in Kansas and elsewhere. Same thing in South America, among Germans from Russia, including some Mennonites beginning to come in. We're at the 150th anniversary now, 2024. Well, one thing, remember, these are some of the privileges they were granted. These were free peasants under the Russian Empire. They weren't serfs. Right? Freedom of religion, no taxes for the first 10 years after arrival. Exemption from military service. Well, that's great. You're not cannon fodder, right? Think of the 7 Years' War, the Napoleonic Wars. Local self-government. Well, after the 1860s and 70s, that's being revoked. And it wasn't necessarily by Alexander's intention to punish the minority populations or non-Russians. He's trying to reform the empire in the wake of a disastrous defeat against against Britain and France in the Crimean War, the 1850s. The old serf system, the old feudal system was inefficient against these modern emerging industrial powers. And so he decides to emancipate the serfs, 80% of the population by 1861, providing compensation for the nobles. He carries out something called Zemstvo reforms in 1864. That has to do with reforms of the local government and local court systems. He's trying to integrate these groups, trying to make everybody on the same level. It was actually well-intentioned. The problem is, if you're more, like many of the Germans Russia groups are, you want to stay with your own, this is a loss of your special privileges. Right? You're going to have to engage more with the outside world. So we have the Zemstvo reforms of 1864. 1871 is a big year. Universal male military conscription. Right? You're a pacifist. Even the Lutherans and Catholics who are Germans in Russia who fled during the Napoleonic Wars, during the 7 Years' War, they're the cannon fodder. There's a kind of a pacifist streak among them too, including some of my families. But the Mennonites especially, you get word of this, that's an incentive to start sending your scouts out abroad to find other prime locations to get out of here. So that the military conscription kicked in 1874. So again, we go back to the 150th anniversary of the arrival of some of these folks here. So all these privileges are being revoked. Again, Alexander was trying to reform the empire. He's not trying to punish anybody, but a lot of folks didn't like this. And I can see why. Now, probably the other thing, at least for the Mennonites anyway, besides military conscription, really the other big issue was becoming apparent. That's land hunger. And sometimes the Lutheran and Catholic Germans from Russia, they talk about military conscription. That's true, that was a concern. But land hunger was a big issue as well. Even without military conscription, the populations are growing rapidly. I mentioned the Mennonite growth, the rapid growth here. These are folks, even back in days of high infant mortality rates and all of that, these are big families. The way land was apportioned, it's hard, to make a living. And you have overpopulation, not enough arable farmland for sale. And by the way, after the 1860s, the Mennonites aren't able to buy up some of these lands from the nobles. That might be parceled out to some of the peasants or whatever. Or maybe there might be some anti-German sentiment and resentment. They don't sell the lands. These folks have to look elsewhere for making a living. And so land hunger was a really big issue. And I think it was one of the overriding issues for at least the first 10 or 20 years of the immigration out. But for the Mennonites also, I'd say certainly military conscription was part of that. But the land hunger issue we tend to overlook. Now, after the 1880s and 90s, and this is a common misunderstanding among Germans from Russia in general, we always talk about the anti-German sentiment. That's something a little bit later than the land hunger and military conscription issue. This began after the 1880s, after the unification of the German Empire. And some of the diplomatic fronts began to change in Europe, the alliance systems. And so you start seeing a growing emphasis on Russification, growing anti-German sentiment. That became a factor too, as ethnic and political tensions began to grow. And especially after 1905, after the Russo-Japanese War in 1904-05, Russia lost that war against this upstart first modern Asian power called Japan. That nearly rocked the regime to its destruction. And a lot of people start leaving the empire thinking, you know what, this thing may not last. And you see a rapid outflux of people, Lutheran, Catholic, Mennonite. There's a lot of Jews are leaving Russia too. They're getting out after 1905 up until the outbreak of World War I. So yes, the Russification thing, the anti-German sentiment, that's something that's a little bit later. That kind of adds to the momentum here of the migrations. What's interesting, this was true also among the other subgroups of the Germans in Russia, only about 20% of all ethnic Germans, emigrated between the early 1870s up until roughly the outbreak of World War I. So about 80%, 4 in 5, stayed behind in the Russian Empire. Now later, in letters that were written after the First World War, after the rise of communism, the Soviet Union, some of these folks say, I wish we would have left in 1913. But most people prefer to stay where they're at. So only a small minority, 20% left. Among the Mennonites, roughly 1/3, I think I have that at the top, roughly 1/3 of all Mennonites emigrated during this period. A little bit higher percentage, but still, 2/3 had stayed behind, at least until 20th century. Now we're moving into the turn of the last century. And again, this will tie in with our talk tomorrow with North and South America. But this kind of is an overlap because we're using Russia as kind of the foundation here for our talk over these 2 days at this lecture series. The first migrations began, especially Protestant, but with a sizable Catholic migration to North America in the early 1870s. It also includes Canada, the Canadian Prairie provinces as well, as parts of the United States, especially the Great Plains. Later, from the United States and Canada in the wake of World War I and problems with issues of military conscription and all that, you'll see some more conservative Mennonites move to Mexico, northwest Mexico, in particular after 1920, even other parts of the Caribbean and Central America, and even parts of South America. So here we have multiple diasporas, from Russia to Canada, the United States, and then later maybe to Latin America. So this began in the 1870s up through the 1920s. Again, in Latin America, we have a higher percentage of Catholic settlements, but again, some Mennonites will be there as well. Also, we have a sizable migration directly to South America. Argentina is probably getting ready for its 150th anniversary next year. The first arrivals to Argentina, later Brazil. So this was happening. For some people, that was their first choice. Again, we'll talk more about that tomorrow. Again, very quickly, and I'll throw this out at the next two talks, but to kind of give you kind of a sense of what's going on here, these are very rough estimates, so we have to be very cautious here of the numbers, but it gives you an idea. These are massive migrations of people. It's not just a few hundred. We're talking about hundreds of thousands, millions of people leaving the Russian Empire. And they're not the only ethnic group leaving the Russian Empire. I keep laughing when I look at celebrities and various people, politics. Everybody's got somebody from the Russian Empire at one point or another. Everybody's getting out, right? It's a big country, big empire. Whether you're Jewish, Polish, Lithuanian, ethnic German, Ukrainian, whatever. Everybody seems to have a Russian connection. But these are figures from roughly 1940, compiled by Dr. Karl Stump, who, a whole other history I could talk about here. He's kind of the dean of the North American literature of Germans from Russia. He was from Ukraine. He was of Lutheran background. He was a scholar. He went to Germany after the end of World War I. He starts cultivating interest in his kinsfolk who stayed behind. He's also interested in migrations abroad. He does cartography. He does demographics. He's kind of an all-round scholar trying to preserve what remained of his diaspora people. So he was compiling records of populations in North and South America already in the 1930s. He did work for the Nazi government also. He was a Nazi party member. Even though he's an immigrant from Russia, he was German, the Weimar Republic, but he was very keen on finding out where are all these other Germans located. And it's part of the Greater Reich, really. So we have 200,000 in Canada. Today there's over 1 million at least. The one problem we do have, though, is intermarriage and mixed marriages. That was already happening in the early 20th century, more so true today. But these just give you ideas of people who can claim at least some heritage. Again, these are very rough numbers. The United States had nearly 400,000. There's at least 1 million today. Their descendants, if not more. Now, Mexico today, thanks to the 1920 migrations from Canada and the U.S., roughly 30,000 by 1940, maybe 100,000 today. Brazil, another land of immigration, especially Catholic immigrants, 250,000 already by 1940, over 1 million today, including some Mennonites, not all Catholic. Argentina, 150,000 by 1940. According to the German embassy, about 10 years ago, maybe 1 to 2 million Germans from Russia ancestry. That's not including Germans from Germany. Huge group, many Volga Germans among them, including, of course, many Catholics, along with a few Lutherans, Mennonite enclaves. Very sizable group. Later we'll talk about Paraguay and Uruguay tomorrow, but there's a few thousand there. Many of them, most of the Mennonites, maybe 45,000 in Paraguay today. Uruguay we're not sure about. But that gives you an idea. This is huge. Okay. Boy, there's a lot to talk about here. This is actually my area. I deal with the Soviet Union more than anything. Okay, where to begin? We talk about age of revolutions, age of extremes. Now we're moving to the heart of what became the 20th century, a brutal century in ways that we had not imagined before. Period roughly from 1914, the outbreak of World War I, up through the mid-1950s following the death of Joseph Stalin, right, the Soviet dictator. And a lot was happening. And our group, Germans from Russia, but Mennonites included, fell in the middle of this. So let's take a look, just a quick listing of what happened. World War I, first major war in Europe since 1815, ending the second longest period of relative peace in European history since the Roman Empire. We're in the third longest period right now. You got 20 years to beat the second longest record. Okay. Russian revolutions break out. There was one in March of 1917. You have a provisional government overthrowing the monarchy. And then the Bolsheviks stage a coup in November of that year. So we have the first communist regime in world history. Eventually they pull Russia out of the war in 1918. Now you end up with a civil war between the communists, the Reds, and everybody else from 1918 to 1920. More bloodshed. Okay. And then, of course, the leader there, Vladimir Lenin, he's the dictator. He's actually the model for future dictators, whether it's Hitler, Mussolini, and others. He's a guy who's a nobody. In a very short period of time, he's the head of a very powerful state. Intelligent guy, ruthless, trained as a lawyer. He's a professional revolutionary. He became a model for other nobodies to become great dictators, even though they may disagree with his ideology. At any rate, he's the dictator from 1917 to 1924, the head of the Bolshevik Party, the future communists. A lot of bloodshed, a lot of turmoil, terror, but there is a brief breathing period in the mid-20s as the Soviet Union tries to sort its leadership crisis out, eventually with Joseph Stalin taking power by the late 20s. He'll rule until the early 50s. And he's going to carry out what he calls the second revolution from above. We're going to pacify the countryside. We're going to crush the peasant resistance. We're going to further the collectivization of agriculture. And of course, that will help fund the nationalization of the growing industrial sector as well. And he'll start doing that by the 1930s. It's called the Revolution from Above. And later, this will tie in with the Great Terror, the purges, all that sort of stuff. Of course, to add on to it, we have the Second World War. And we're going to talk about very briefly here in a moment. 1935 to 45, but it was known as the Great Patriotic War of 1941 to 45 in the Russian mindset, like the Soviet Union. They initially were allies of Nazi Germany briefly, but this is really where the war really intensifies. It's on the Eastern Front. We have something called the Long Trek. Again, we're talking about wars, revolutions, persecutions, mass dislocations, repression, mass dislocations. In 1943 to 45, about 35 Mennonites fled westward with the retreating German armies. Mostly women and children and elderly. Most of the young men are conscripted at this point, fighting for Germany. These are people from Ukraine that had not been removed by the Soviets in time before their German advance. 35,000 fled, the Red Army at that time. About two-thirds of those, about 23,000 of them, will be repatriated back as Soviet citizens to the Soviet Far East. I'll talk briefly about that in just a moment. So they're repatriated back in 45, 46, and they'll be in confinement up until the mid-50s. And then finally, there's a group that did make it west after World War II, about 12,000 Mennonites among others. They become displaced persons, many of them moving on to places like Canada, the United States, parts of South America, even Australia. They're displaced persons. That was mostly in the late 40s, early 50s. Okay, so a lot happening here. And remember, this is happening in some people's lifetime. They're experiencing it all. Lots of trauma. Tied in with this, we have the American Volga Relief Society, the VRS. This is the future embryo of our heritage groups today. It actually goes back to the 1920s and 30s. Initially, it was a famine relief society by Germans from Russia over here to help people in need following the famines, partly man-made, but also partly environmental, that followed the Russian Civil War. And the Soviet government was desperate for outside assistance. They reluctantly allowed Western aid in to places like the Volga region and also parts of Ukraine, which were receiving a lot of refugees from the Volga, people who were starving to death. These are actually Volga Germans from the 1920s. There's some documentation of that. So we have a Volga Relief Society. There's also a North Dakota group, mostly Lutherans and Catholics, the NDCRA, the North Dakota Citizens Relief Association. They also were involved in this effort. And they all were kind of coordinated by the ARA, the American Relief Administration, during the Great Famine in the early 20s. And as you may know, the head of the ARA is Herbert Hoover, great humanitarian. Had a great career before and after his time as president, tend to forget. He was involved in relief efforts in World War I for refugees in Belgium. Oops, Stalin's sneaking in here. Later, he's involved with this effort in the early 20s. And by the way, it's interesting to note, the Soviet secret police were surveilling the ARA in Ukraine and in the Volga as these relief efforts are going on. So yeah, they're taking the aid in, but they're also wary of these Westerners there. But in case he's involved with it. Okay, Stalin wants to be in on this. Okay, I haven't ever recall about anything on him. He's the head now of the Soviet Union from the late 20s until 1953, successor of Lenin. Again, you can see all that's happening here, one thing after another. Collectivization of agriculture, first 5-year plan. We have the murder famine, deliberate man-made famine in Ukraine that affects also other groups, including ethnic Germans. 1932 to 33. It's considered by, I think, 16 countries, including the United States, as a genocide now. It took him about 80 years to figure that out. But it was deliberate. He would have deported all those Ukrainians, but there are too many to deport. But he did deport 13 nationality groups, I should say, national minority groups in the Soviet Union, 13 of them between 1937 and 1951. The first group were the Soviet Koreans from the Far East. The Volga Germans in particular, with a few Black Sea Germans, were in 1941. This was happening in a period from 1937 until 1951. The ethnic Germans, especially the Volga, who constituted a good part of it, 1.3 million ethnic Germans were deported by Stalin during World War II to Soviet East Asia, Central Asia, Siberia, and the Arctic regions. We were the largest of the deported peoples. That includes some Mennonites, of course, as well. Later, some of these poor folks who were deported, they ended up in the labor army during World War II, the 1940s. And then afterwards, they're put in so-called special settlements. And by 1948, they're banned for all time to be in exile or observation. They're basically segregated from the rest of society. But when Stalin died, Khrushchev decided to let these folks free. But they can't go back to their own villages or their homelands. They remain in Soviet Siberia or Central Asia. But they were released in 1955. Later, Khrushchev, his successor, as I said, will allow them to be released. He only grants them partial rehabilitation, though, in the 60s. But I want you to take a look at this here. Boris Yeltsin will become the first president of the post-communist Russian Federation. He was a rival of Gorbachev in the late 80s, early 90s, just before he took over as president of the RSFSR. That's the Soviet Russian state within the Soviet Union, the biggest of them all. He signed a law. Literally, it stated that genocide and slander were waged against the deported and repressed peoples in the USSR under Stalin. And the largest of those groups was the ethnic Germans. This was in April of 1991. Has anybody ever heard of this decree? Of course not. I didn't know until about 2000. Nobody reported on it. I had to find a newspaper. I had a colleague doing research on comparative genocide studies. So they actually admitted to it. And Yeltsin was jockeying for political support from the national minorities, trying to get Western outside aid, obviously. But that's a big, big announcement. But nobody knows about it. Okay. Now, as we move into the latter part of this talk here very quickly, we have desperate Mennonites and others, of course, trying to get out of Stalin's Russia during this time of tumult. There were some who actually got legal permission after some negotiations with the German government. The Soviet Union did allow a last train out of Mennonites out of Moscow in December of 1929. I know a woman whose grandparents and parents were part of that. She's Mennonite from British Columbia, Canada. I'll talk about her in just a moment. They were literally on the last train out. After that, nobody's released from the Soviet Union. Who wants to leave the Soviet paradise, right? They are the last ones to get out. There are also cases, and perhaps you've heard of these, of individuals, families, even an entire village in one case, escaping across the border via China to the Western Hemisphere, in particular places like Paraguay in South America. This was at the beginning of the 1930s. I'll give you one great example. Has anybody heard of this one? A couple of you. Yes. And back in these days, by the way, in 1930, the early gulags, the early prison camps, they weren't as sophisticated as they became later in the 1930s. Stalin is still perfecting that system. Also, the borders are not tightly controlled just yet. I had an extended relative that fled the Soviet Union after escaping from a gulag. They went through Romania. From the Arctic region, they came back and went to Romania. That's in 1930. You still have cases where you can get out of these systems. So it's not until the late 30s that the country is pacified, the countryside is pacified, the peasant resistance is crushed, the borders are better secured. So you do have cases of people, and it was still hard to do. You literally physically got out of the country if you could. This book, Escape from the Amur River, came out in 1946 in German. It was translated in 2001. You can buy it, go online. It's right there, high in the algorithm. 217 refugees from a village. They probably were in Soviet Siberia. They got out just as collectivization starting, and they fled through Chinese Manchuria, and they ended up in Paraguay. This was in 1930. Make a movie out of that. Okay. By the way, this shows you the deportations in the late 30s, early 40s, even in the early 1950s under Stalin in this case, this is the 1941 to 45 deportations of Germans in the Soviet Union. Again, some of the Western Germans got out from Ukraine, but before the Soviets could get to them, 1941. But these are folks like the Volga Germans who couldn't get out to begin with. And these also include some of those who were repatriated back in 1945, 46. And that includes, of course, some Mennonites too. And a few of my family members, I guess, who were in the Arctic region and later ended up in Kazakhstan after they were released. Oklahoma is the land of Indian removal. Well, Siberia is the Russian version of that. Look at all the other peoples and remove them there. Something else you may be familiar with, maybe in your own family histories, very quickly. Again, we may touch upon this in the North American topic tomorrow. Starting even before the end of World War I, but up through the late 1930s in some cases, but the 20s and 30s in particular, we have extensive letter writing between family members on both sides of the Atlantic. These newspapers go back to at least the 1870s and 80s. By the 1920s, people are talking about what's happening in Russia, right? The Soviet Union. And a vast underground network of letters circulated within the Soviet Union and beyond, reporting on events during the Stalin persecutions, up until about 1937 when the letters basically stopped. By that point, the Soviet Union is pretty much cut off from the rest of the world, with a few exceptions for the next generation. Some letters even appeared in German language newspapers across the Great Plains, including the Dakotas and Nebraska at this time. And again, these newspapers go back to the late 19th century, the Dakota Free Presse in the Dakotas, the Belt Post in Nebraska, and a few other regional newspapers in the Dakotas and elsewhere sometimes would publish these letters. They might leave the letter writers anonymous to protect them and their families back in Russia, but they're telling about the way things are. And some of these are translated later on by folks today, but at the time these were in German. But not everybody published these letters either. A lot of families kept their letters safely tucked away to be translated and read decades later. Again, many of these German language newspapers in the Dakotas, with lots of German from Russia readers, they continued until about the Second World War. The circulations kind of dried up by the 40s and 50s. Here's one example, a famine or a gulag letter to North America from the 1930s. And sometimes the Soviet authorities allowed that to happen. If I were a secret police chief, I want to know what people are talking about. It'd be like with the internet, go ahead and write about it. We'll try to find out what you're doing. Later, they do begin to really restrict it, but in some ways also, I think they're also trying to find out what's happening. But this is an interesting technique. The Soviet communists, or actually the Bolsheviks used to do this before they took power under the Tsarist secret police. They write in code, secret messages, so the censors or the authorities can't figure out what you're talking about. These folks are now doing it under the communists. And Dr. Ruth Dirksen Siemens, who's a retired English professor from the University of British Columbia in Vancouver, she was a Russian Mennonite descendant. Her grandparents, and I believe her very young parents, were on the last train out of Moscow in 1929. They went to British Columbia, Canada, and in 1989 a set of 463 letters written between 1930 and 37 were found in a Campbell's soup box in the attic or in the basement. And they translated it. Later, that set was authenticated by UK scholar Anne Applebaum back in the early 2000s. This is the largest set of famine or gulag letters to be authenticated that we know of today, 463. And she had these translated into English, published. Later made an effort to get the word out about this topic. She donated copies of these letters to Memorial, the memorial group. It's called Memorial, but it was meant to remember the victims of communism in Russia. Putin's kind of shut them down now. But she was very keen on getting this story out. It's very dramatic. It should be made into a movie. Later, this book came out, I think in 2008. She made an accompanying DVD documentary. And I have actually a copy of each of these. I'm going to donate to the collection here. So I'm going to give this to you. This is the Remember Us by Dr. Siemens with translations of the letters. And the DVD is called The Red Gate, about that train ride. So please put that in your collection. If you want more copies, I can direct people to them online. But I want to give that to our Mennonite host here tonight. At any rate, I had her give a talk at our university in 2009, but she talks about this use of subversive writing techniques, coded language, using opposite meanings to bypass the Soviet censors. Okay, and that's what's significant. This is a window into what was happening in the 1930s from their perspectives as peasants, as Soviet citizens, everyday folks. We can talk more about that. We're still in the age of extremes. We're almost at the end here. Caught between the black swastika and the red star. You got the two men squaring off, these larger-than-life figures. To use Eric Hobsbawm's term, the age of ideological extremes, right? Nazism, National Socialism versus Soviet communism. And they fought it out on the Eastern Front. This is really where World War II was the bloodiest. 3 and 4 German soldiers died on the Eastern Front. Millions of Soviets died, civilian and military. The Western Front was bad enough. The Mediterranean was bad enough, but the Eastern Front was something else. And our group's caught in the middle, especially in Ukraine. We were talking about dinner earlier. This is the museum in Gdansk, former Danzig, where Mennonites used to live in West Prussia centuries ago. This is from 2018. This is a display of Soviet and Nazi flags from each other at the exhibit there. They have a World War II museum there. Of course, Danzig was a hot spot in the lead up to World War II between Germany and Poland. Yeah, but there's a Mennonite connection to that city, right, originally. So it's just kind of like to dramatically highlight that here as well. The Germans did occupy Ukraine for a few years. I won't get into all of that. It's another story. It includes also some Mennonites there. By the way, there were Mennonites who fought in the Red Army early on in the war, who later got captured by German forces, and then the German speakers, they're now fighting for the German side. It's kind of interesting, these folks who get kind of tossed about between these two sides. But especially the civilians, though, they're under Nazi administration in Ukraine. Most of these folks were not deported by the Soviets. There was not enough time to do that, as with the Volga Germans. But by 1943, the war's turning. The Nazi authorities realized we've got to get these ethnic Germans out. We'll take them back to the Greater Reich. We'll take them to occupied Poland, the Wartegau, which was part of Poland, now part of Greater Germany. We'll bring the ethnic Germans back to their ancient homeland. And this is a mass evacuation on a massive scale of over 350,000 people, primarily from Ukraine, including 35,000 Mennonites, 23,000 of whom will be repatriated back. Himmler was overseeing this. The SS actually oversaw this. They're the ones who processed these ethnic Germans in the Reich. So these people are accompanied by SS forces, not German army as such. They did promise them, we'll return you home once we win the war, but I think they kind of knew the writing was on the wall. And of course, most people are not going to complain. They don't want to be under the Red Army. So we'll go with you. We'll go with the Germans here. All right. I mentioned this before. 350,000 Germans from Nazi-occupied Ukraine brought into occupied Poland, late 43 to early 44. About 20 to 25,000, or about 7% of that group died on the way. But again, of the Mennonites who are part of this, there are about 35,000 in all, mostly women, children, and elderly. Again, the men are at war. And again, only 1/3 made it west, got to stay in the west. I won't get into all these details here. Major offensive, and again, the Red Army's on the heels of these folks as they head west. Operation Bagration was a counterpart to Operation Overlord in June of 44. And that's when basically the Soviets liberate the Soviet Union. And a lot of our folks are trying to get out this way as the troops are coming in, the Red Army this way as well. They just barely keep ahead of them. And then later in January 45, the last offensive towards Berlin. And again, from the Warthegau, these folks try to head even farther west. Again, many of them don't make it. Of the 350,000, by the way, who evacuated, 200,000 were repatriated back. Only 70,000 or so made it to the west. Again, most Mennonites didn't make it. So this ends 150 years or more of ethnic German history in Ukraine in particular. And so now those villages today are occupied by Ukrainians and others. Again, the refugees worked their way west. I won't get into all of this here. We're nearing the end here. But again, 350,000, by late 45, many are reclaimed by the Soviet Union as Soviet citizens, along with other Soviet citizens of different nationalities. They're brought back and taken, although they're promised to be taken back to their villages, they go to the camps in the Arctic or Siberia, into special settlements. Even the Western authorities initially helped the Soviets do this. Operation Keelhaul, unofficially it was called. They're actually allowing Soviet posses to cross into the Western occupied zones to take these folks away. Later, they stopped doing it. Only about 70,000 of the original 350,000 made it west and stayed in the west, and about 12,000 Mennonites. And again, those who went east go to the special settlements. They're there until the 1950s. Many remain in that part of Russia, or that part of the Soviet Union, like Kazakhstan, up until the 1990s. Again, those who made it west, many decided we're going to leave. About 30,000 of the 70,000 who stayed west, they decide they're going to get the heck out of occupied Germany. They can't get far enough away from the Soviet Union, literally. And they're desperate. Germany's a defeated nation, it's destroyed. They're going to try to network with family and friends abroad in North and South America. How can I get out? And by the late 40s, early 50s, there are opportunities as legally defined displaced persons. So about 30,000 will move to Australia, but most to the United States and Canada, and a certain number also to South America, including some Mennonites. These are actually Mennonites here from 1952. At the same time, some of my extended family or displaced persons came to North Dakota. They were from the Black Sea region, but they weren't Mennonite. Same time, most came by 1952. Here they are waiting in West Germany at this point. See the little identification tags, right? And usually there was a promise that when you got to your host country, you had job employment opportunities to be an income earner, so you're not a dependent on the state or anybody else. You had to have guaranteed employment. So families and friends would help arrange that for these folks. So here they are waiting to board the train, take the ship out of Bremen for wherever they're going. And again, they're assisted by the International Red Cross, various charity groups, sorry about that, including Mennonite Central Committee. Again, they're among the best networked among some of these groups. But you had Lutheran and Catholic charities, Baptists, Methodists, all involved in trying to help these people get a footing and maybe seek opportunities elsewhere. And also, they're also looking for lost loved ones and friends during the war. Again, in the United States, but also later other countries, we have displaced persons laws set up. Harry Truman passed the first piece of legislation in 1948, the Displaced Persons Act, or DPs as we call them, permitting the entry of people dislocated by World War II into the U.S. And again, you had to have a guarantee of employment to be able to come in. It might be a family member or a friend, or maybe one of these agencies that could set up employment. They would help guarantee that. A lot of paperwork involved. This could take a few years to do. Again, other policies appeared elsewhere in places like Canada, Australia, and elsewhere. The largest three groups of displaced persons: Holocaust survivors, Jews, ethnic Germans from Eastern Europe, and especially East European groups like the Poles. So the idea is that these people are fleeing statewide persecution, state-sponsored persecution. They were removed during wartime duress, with legitimate reasons why they're displaced. So again, all these legal definitions had to be fulfilled here as well. And again, this is interesting. This ties in with the Mennonites. Some of these Mennonites were separated from family after World War II because of the repatriation. So some of them who were in the Soviet Union, some of them got permission during an easing of tensions during the Cold War to immigrate to West Germany in the 1970s. And then later, after the 1990s, after the Cold War, that's the real opportunity to get out of the Soviet Union and enjoy, meeting up again with family members in a new united Germany. And this is interesting. Timothy Cloberdance made this point, but I guess I kind of subconsciously knew this. This migration of Germans out of the Soviet Union, the former Soviet Union, during the 1990s, over 2.5 million. This is the largest German-Russian migration in their history. It happened in our lifetime, in the 1990s, after the Cold War. And some of these Mennonites who went to West Germany, they're not sure what to make of a much more secular society. They thought this land of gold and honey of Germany, the ancient homeland, would be just as they imagined it. And some of them were disappointed, and of course some of them ended up migrating to Canada in the 1990s. They've got family there. Some of them are still migrating to Canada from United Germany. Even some of the Mennonites were having problems in the 1970s. West German society was so secular, kind of like the Soviets. Maybe not as bad. But this is not the traditional cultures they thought that would be there. Things had changed over 200 years. So again, we can see further migrations elsewhere after they get to the West, after the Cold War. Now, very quickly, as I wrap up here, I'll open up for quick questions. Again, there's so much more we can talk about. Again, we've got more to talk about tomorrow. I want to finish up with this topic. The Mennonites are part of that. It's not to play a victim narrative, but we have to remember the history and move on, of course, but we can't forget it, right? Imagine those folks who went through that who thought they'd be forgotten. Well, they're not forgotten. The victims of communism worldwide. A book came out in the late 1990s, written by people who are of the political left, but they're fair-minded folks. They were from France. Has anybody heard of the Black Book of Communism? Came out in 1997, published in English in 1999. Check it out. It's on my bookshelf. I read it in the early 2000s. These guys did a study of all the communist regimes since Russia in 1917, starting with Russia up to the present day. An estimated 90 to 100 million people have died since 1917 worldwide under these various communist regimes. I guess not to avoid the Nazi Holocaust or anything like that, but this is the other Holocaust you don't hear about. You think about both of them. Interesting. 100 million, about 20 to 30 million of those are in the Soviet Union alone, mostly under Stalin. Nearly 1 million of those were ethnic Germans, including some Mennonites. We were the largest of the deported peoples, by the way. We were the 15th largest nationality in the Soviet Union. So we lost a huge part of our population over that period of about 1917 to 1953. And of course, China actually has a higher total. They have 40 to 60 million under Chairman Mao. I don't hear about that. Outstrips Hitler and Stalin. But he had a little bit more time to do that. But many millions more fell victim in Cambodia, China, Cuba, North Korea, Vietnam, and of course the former Soviet bloc nations of Eastern Europe. think of Poland or Romania or places like that. I have a good friend of mine who's got roots from Hong Kong. Her family fled Chinese communists during the Civil War in the late 40s. Okay, I had a student that had a father that was a resistance fighter from Southeast Asia in the 1970s, fighting communists down there, former Cambodia. He got his kid out, went to the United States. He actually serves in the armed forces right now. He's probably in his 40s. So we have all these different folks of different backgrounds dealing with these different communist regimes. Mine happened to be the Soviet Union. So we have a lot in common despite as different as we are. We can share that. And of course, just to remind you, and you notice this Statue of Freedom based on the Statue of Liberty. This is a statue that was erected in 2007 on the 20th anniversary of President Reagan's Berlin Wall speech, Tear This Wall Down speech. Mr. Gorbachev, please tear down this wall. In 1987, this came out in 2007. It was a bipartisan effort, Democrats and Republicans. It's in Washington, D.C. there. But this commission was set up called the Victims of Communism Memorial Foundation. It was established by the U.S. Congress in 1993, right after the Cold War. It was a bipartisan effort. By 2007, they dedicated the statue there in D.C. This is a statue modeled on that was used by the Chinese protesters in Beijing in 1989. Of course, nobody remembers that, right? At least not in China. And finally, in 2022, the Victims of Communism Memorial Museum was opened up in Washington, D.C. So we've got the Holocaust Museum, fantastic, and we've got the Victims of Communism Museum right down the street. Has anybody ever heard of this museum? Of course not. I always test my audiences. I didn't even know much about this, and I was in the research field. You never hear about it. And we need to hear about all these different terrible regimes. I'm equal opportunity disliker here. But in any case, more than 1.5 billion persons today still live under a communist regime, most of them in China. Check it out. Check out their website. Really good. If you get a chance. I need to go there sometime. I need to go to both museums. By the way, speaking of that, I want to tell you one other story and then I'm done. This was from about 2016. Oops, sorry. These guys out of the way. The Hammer and Sickle. This was at a Comic-Con convention I went to. Got to see William Shatner, among other things. I was with some friends, Tulsa. And these were up for sale. And I thought, look at that. We got a hammer and sickle. You can actually put a swastika up there. And the reason why I mentioned that, remember Dr. Ruth Dirksen Siemens, that huge letter collection? The Russian Mennonite whose family got out on the last train to Vancouver, British Columbia, 1929, 1930. She told a story at our talk in 2009. Back in the early 2000s, she had a son who was in junior high, and it was really hip and fashion to wear Soviet belt buckles up in Canada. And she saw it one day. She goes, son, I'm going to have you talk to your grandparents. They're going to tell you a little bit about what that symbol stood for your family. And he did that, and the next day he wasn't wearing it anymore. So I just kind of point that out, you know. And again, symbols, sticks and stones may break my bones, but, you know. In any case, I just like to point that out. Of course, how commercialized this all is. But again, then you've got this here nobody knows about. Something to think about. One last thing, and I'm done. Okay, and we'll open up for quick questions very quickly. We don't want to go too long. And I'm always happy to talk with you later or even tomorrow or through the internet. There was talk about 15 years ago, before things really went downhill with Putin, but President Medvedev on the left, he was briefly president. He was a protege of Vladimir Putin on the right, who's president for much of the period since 1999. There was talk about, again, Russia's had a huge population loss, demographic decline, economic problems. But there were some oil revenues being generated. There was this desire made to recruit human capital back to the former Soviet Union, especially to Russia. And so there was talk about maybe inviting Westerners to move back to Russia, to Mother Russia, including some Mennonites. And apparently there were some folks looking into that. But as far as I know, there have been no Mennonites returning back to Siberia or anything like that. But there's actually talk about that back in the late 00s, early teens. Does anybody remember that story? was an article that came out. I thought, I don't think many people can take up the offer. But Russia was so desperate to bring some of these people back, they lost a major labor pool, especially those hardworking Germans. Okay. I'm going to use 4 languages to say thank you for your time and attention. I hope this was enlightening. Thank you. And if there's any questions, I'm happy to answer in the few minutes remaining. And again, I can talk with some of you more later tomorrow. Thank you. All right.
Okay,
You'll get an A+. There's no test after this, so you're all fine. I was like to reassure my folks.
okay, we have some time for questions.
Got one. Got a couple there.
This is about Alexander II's emancipation of the serfs.
Yeah.
Do you know how that impacted, in particular, Mennonites or other groups? How did they respond, and was it an economic boost or a decline for them?
You know, it's interesting. And of course, the Mennonites had some huge land holdings in Ukraine. Of course, there's land hunger, growing populations. There were some, might have been even earlier than that, but there were, after the 1860s, there were some Russian peasants, freed peasants, who worked on some of these farms. And not just among Mennonites, but even in the Black Sea region, among Lutherans and Catholics, they might have what they call the Kudors, right? These are large estates. These are the wealthier Germans. So some of them were labor for some of these folks too, free labor. But the Tsar wanted to have some of these people move to the cities to work in the factories to help modernize Russia in the wake of the Crimean War. But certainly that would have impacted the economy. You would have had some folks who maybe are now free laborers willing to work on independent farms. Of course, even leading up to this period and even after, increasingly Russians are less likely to sell land to Mennonites too. Probably envy, and later with the anti-German sentiment. And so there's increasing land hunger because the Mennonites were able to snatch up these lands from some of the nobles who didn't have the peasants to work them anymore. But increasingly it's getting harder to buy these lands because they're kind of resented by some of the Russians. But so yeah, there was some labor. There are opportunities to buy up lands from the nobles who've lost that cheap labor pool. They have to sell off their lands or at least rent them. But over time, increasingly though, the Mennonites are running out of options. So I don't know if I've answered your question there, but does that kind of help maybe a little bit?
Eric, could you just briefly elaborate, even though she wasn't Mennonite, on one of the displaced persons, Emma Rieger, who was, she and her family were on the long trek and were brought over by your great-grandfather after the trek?
Yeah, we have a very similar story to some of these Mennonites and others on the long trek. It was the first cousin once removed of my great-grandfather, your grandfather, it's my father, in the Schmaltz family. They were from a Catholic village. In this case, I have Lutherans and Catholics here, and the Germans from Russia side. But at any rate, this was a Catholic village, hit hard by the collectivization drive. Her mother actually took care of a dying Catholic bishop. He was the last bishop in the Soviet Union for a time in the 1920s, hounded by the authorities. He died in her household in that village. They held a public funeral for him in front of the authorities in 1932. She's arrested shortly thereafter, and she's shot by the NKVD with 4,700 others from that region of Ukraine, 1937 in Odessa, nearby. So her mother was killed off, and then she ended up being in the village during World War II, and she married a man who was conscripted by the military SS, like many of these poor guys are conscripted. But she was part of the long trek. She ended up in the western part of Germany, but her sister, most of her villagers were repatriated back to the Soviet Union. Her husband made it west, and then later they got sponsorship from my great-grandfather, who was a retired businessman in North Dakota, guaranteeing them that they'd have employment and all that. They ended up migrating from West Germany in 1952. He died just a few months before they got there, though, but they did end up in North Dakota. He worked for a motor company. She worked as a laundress. She had 4 kids. This shows you all the migrations like these Mennonites too. One was born in Soviet Ukraine, before World War II. The other was born in occupied Germany. No, I'm sorry. No, it was born in occupied Ukraine. It was called Transnistria. It's under Romanian administration with Nazi supervision, separate country. And then her third child was born in occupied Germany. And her fourth kid was born in the United States. So she said, I have 4 kids in 4 countries. But I showed you her dislocation. A lot of trauma. She was interviewed in the 1990s. They didn't talk a lot about this. I know you've maybe met her. I didn't know about this story until the late 90s. Because you have the Nazi side of the story, and you've got the communist side. So, but that's kind of emblematic of a lot of these families, including Mennonites, who you hear about this. These should be made into Hollywood movies. And you can't make this stuff up. Does that help answer your question? Any other questions? It's interesting, some of the things we've talked about we're not aware of, and other things, we hear about more commonly. All speechless. You may have questions that come to mind later, too, so I'll be happy later on through the history department here at Bethel, communicate with people long after we meet here at these lecture series.
Well, you will have a couple other opportunities tomorrow, because the second lecture is going to be at 11 a.m. in this auditorium, and the third lecture will be at 7 p.m. tomorrow. So thank you for coming tonight, and we hope to see you for both of those tomorrow.
Thank you very much. We'll do North America and South America. Thank you.